About a year and a half ago, my best friend of 15 plus years and I took a trip out to my family farm at night after getting out of our second shift job. It was a nice, clear, crisp, early fall night in Michigan. We were sitting there just chit-chatting away and watching the night sky when he asked a very peculiar question. He said, "This place has always had a strange feel to it, almost like you were being watched. Did something happen here? Something bad, I mean?" I just laughed a little and replied that I only knew the stories that my father told me. I told him about how when my great-grandpa purchased the farm in the early 30s, that it was a big family project to keep it up and running. Relatives would come and help with the chores and in exchange, be able to hunt the land for food. My great-grandpa had a cousin that came over one day, helped out, and asked if he could go out later that night to do some coon hunting. He, of course, got permission and set out shortly after sundown. The next morning, my great-grandpa noticed that his vehicle was still out in the driveway, even though he should have left hours before. It was still dark out, but my great-grandpa knew the area of the land he would be hunting and set off in that direction. He walked back towards the back pasture field, and as he came around a bend, he hollered my cousin's name. He heard a strange yet familiar voice answer him back. He said that the voice chilled him to the bone, that something wasn't quite right about it. So he called out again, and this time, the voice was for sure not his cousin's, but almost like a growl imitating his voice. He said he hightailed it out of there, never looking back. When the sun came up, he took a big group of relatives and farmhands to look for him. They found his gun, loaded but not fired, his hat, which was covered in a brown liquid spattering, and that was all. My great-grandpa had looked for any signs of him for over 60 plus years. The only time he ever held out hope of finding him, my dad said, was when the swamp and the pasture fields by where he was supposed to be hunting dried up. After a while, my great-grandfather gave up hope to ever understanding what happened to him. Life moved on, as it often does. So almost 2 decades passed before anything more strange and unusual happened. It was in the 1950s during deer season that the next strange thing would happen. My great-grandfather had now owned the farm for close to 20 years. During that time, he had heard or thought he had seen some strange things. One day, my great-grandfather, my grandpa, and all my great-uncles were out hunting with a man they called, and this is no joke, Indian Joe. This was a man that my great-grandfather had somehow met over the years. Joe was a full-blooded Indian, although no one seemed to take the time to ask for any more specifics. He was one hell of a shot as well. He almost never missed, and if he did, he didn't miss the second time. So here they all are, out in the back pasture field, about a half a mile away from the farmhouse. There are about 8 people back there pushing the field and driving the deer. Sure enough, they jump a few deer. Joe shoots, wounds one, and has to track him. No big deal, plenty of snow. As he is tracking the wounded animal, he heads into the part of the farm that is largely unkempt. Even to this day, we don't do much with that area, as it is very, very dense underbrush, soggy, and just not worth much as land. He is pushing through when he comes to what looks like a deer trail. My grandfather is close behind, learning the ins and outs of tracking. He was about 11 or 12 at the time. They follow the trail, and it leads to a clearing in the brush. My grandfather to this day still has a hard time explaining just what happened. He says they walked into the clearing and that it was small, no more than probably 6 or 7 feet across, almost perfectly circular. In the center of the circle was what remained of a deer. The body was shredded, almost beyond recognition. Blood, he says, was everywhere he looked, like something had violently tossed the deer around. At this point, Joe took my grandfather and placed him behind him, telling him to take the safety off of his gun and be ready for anything. Joe then proceeds to walk towards the animal, trying to look for any tracks or other evidence of what could do this. They found tracks, but they were unlike anything that my grandfather has ever seen, even if they were distorted by the snow. He said Joe took a look at these tracks, knelt down to get a closer look, then stood abruptly, swearing as he did so. My grandfather remembers seeing a look of terror upon the man's face. Joe grabbed my grandfather by the collar, practically dragging him back out of the brush. On the way out, he swears that he could hear something stalking along beside them about 10 feet off to his right. He never saw anything. Now, once they were clear of the brush, Joe told my grandfather to run back to the house. The others were waiting for them and asked what was wrong, the fear evident on both their faces. Joe told my great-grandfather that the deer was torn to shreds. Then he proceeded to tell him that he should sell this land and that he was sorry, but he would never set foot on the property again. He was asked time and time again to explain what was wrong, what he had seen, but he would never tell anyone. My grandfather told me that in the weeks leading up to Joe's death, he had some form of cancer. He visited him to pay his respects and say goodbye. As he left, my grandpa, one of the most brutally honest people I have ever met, tells me Joe's last words to him were, "We were lucky, you know, Gene. We were lucky to have made it back that day." My grandpa to this day will not set foot back in that area of the farm. In relation to where my supposed cousin disappeared, it is on the opposite side of the farm, close to a full mile away. And that wasn't all. Now, to tell you the story that my father told me, my dad, like his dad, is honest to a fault. He hates liars and has never, to my knowledge, told me anything but the truth. According to my father, this event took place in the late 70s, right before he shipped out for boot camp. He was out on the farm after dark. A buddy and him were having a campfire in what we call the South Meadow, over by the back pasture field from the first part of the story. He swears up and down that they had not been drinking. There had been no drugs of any kind, nothing to alter their perception of reality. This was just one last night, meant to be spent relaxing under stars, shooting the shit with his best friend. He had driven his truck into the meadow. That way they wouldn't have to walk all the way back to the farmhouse in the morning. As the night went on, they began to hear strange sounds coming from the woods that separates the south meadow from the back pasture. It sounded like a big animal walking through the woods, he said, something closer to the size of a bear. His friend, named Mark, was wanting to know what it was, so he grabbed a flashlight. They headed over towards the sound, not thinking that anything bad could happen. As they got closer to the woods, Mark trained the flashlight on the tree line, looking for anything that could be there. At first, they didn't see anything, but they could hear the crashing getting louder, like it was coming near them. They started to back up, realizing this wasn't the smartest move they have ever made. Just as Mark was about to turn the light off, my dad swears he saw a pair of yellow eyes and a mouth full of teeth. He said that something looked off about it, that something about the shape of the mouth and the placement of the eyes relative to where the teeth were was wrong. He described the snout to be very wolf-like, but much, much bigger than any wolf or coyote he has ever seen. Mark apparently had seen this as well. My dad put it, he screamed like a girl and bolted for the truck. My father, seeing no reason not to do the same, joined him. As he neared the truck, he said the creature let out a howl that was so unearthly, it to this day rings in his ears. He couldn't describe what he had heard to me, only that it was so haunting, so primal. He was sure he was about to be set upon. Mark, who I had the distinct pleasure of knowing very, very well before he passed away a few years ago, corroborated my dad's story, adding only that it was the scariest thing he's ever been through, even scarier than surviving a bobcat attack. I think it is important you know my thoughts of these stories before I tell you the final part so far. As I was growing up, I never once truly believed in these being true. I thought they were simply stories told by my family to scare us into being careful on the farm. I never once thought they were real, and it wasn't until after my own experience with the unknown that I began to question my family and realized they had not lied. Back to the very beginning, on the night with myself and my best friend out on the farm. I told him all of this, just as I have told you. After I was finished, he turns to me and asks why the hell hasn't anything been done about it? Why not a grid search or a low-lying aerial photography to see if there was anything to be seen? I chuckled, explaining to him that I was pretty sure these were all ghost stories and that none of it was true. Of course, that was when the world laughed at me and decided to prove just how real these stories were. We had parked up by the barn, which also served as the slaughterhouse. For the last decade, the farm has been on the reserve list. This means that it is no longer farmed, but is set aside for future generations to use. The farm is now largely just a deer camp. The barn is close to the house that my second or third cousins now live in. As we were sitting there, we began to feel uneasy, like something very wrong was about to happen. At first I chalked it up to two grown men getting scared by a dumb ghost story. But as the feeling became more prominent, I could not escape the fact that something felt horribly out of place. And then the dogs my cousins own went ballistic. I mean crazy. This wasn't barks of aggression, but of fear, terror. Something was frightening them out of their minds. The dog pen was about 100 feet of pitch blackness away from us, around the back part of the house, just out of sight. It was basically a chain-link fence with a door, big enough to hold the 3 German shepherds. Over the sound of dogs barking, we could hear something trying to beat the fence down, trying to force its way in or out. I was betting on it being the dogs trying to get out, and I didn't want to be there to be attacked by 3 terrified German shepherds. As I looked at my friend to tell him it was time to go, we heard what I can only describe as the scariest fucking sound I have ever heard. It was a sound that could not be explained, except that to me, it was the herald of death. It chilled me to the core and sent waves of terror through me. I cannot really go into detail more than that. It is something that must be experienced to understand. Without one more word, we were both in the car and throwing gravel everywhere as we booked it out of there. My cousins never woke up to those sounds that night. Apparently they sleep with a white noise machine on, I guess. They did, however, lose a dog that night and have to rebuild the dog pen. The local authorities rolled it out as a coyote attack and moved on. But the sheer ferocity of the attack was beyond anything that even a pack of coyotes would be capable of, and I believe was from something far, far more sinister. When I was 14, my parents transferred me to a private Catholic prep school. I was not happy about changing districts, and I had a really hard time making friends as a young teen. A few weeks into the semester, I was invited to sleep over with 3 girls I knew from English class. I really didn't know these girls very well, but my mom made me go anyway, in an effort to help me adjust. One of the girls, we'll call her Kathy, brought tarot cards and a Ouija board to the party. I never played with a Ouija before, and didn't consider myself a believer in anything outside the realm of science and logic. I was assured it was nothing more than a board game based on a legend, and because I was a goth, I would enjoy the experience. The 4 of us, Zoe, Kathy, Jess, and myself, set up the board in the late afternoon in the middle of Jess's bedroom. Right from the start, the board was crazy active. I was heavily skeptical and didn't want to play if the other girls weren't going to take it seriously. They swore they weren't messing around. Strangely, the board continued to spell out things like hello and play over and over before we could ask it any direct questions. We finally asked if there was a spirit with us and if it had a name, to which it responded, Hector. This was when Jess began getting anxious. She told us that when she was about 5, she had a childhood imaginary friend named Hector. Still skeptical but officially creeped out, we asked Hector if he had any other spirits with him. He said yes. We asked if he knew their names. With no hesitation, the board spelled out the name Marie. Now this time, Zoe broke down crying and didn't want to play anymore. We stopped playing to console her, but she was very worked up. Apparently, just 3 months earlier, her grandmother Marie had passed away from cancer. Since we were only classmates, there was no way any of us could have known about that event. Zoe refused to play with that board after that, despite our attempts to get her to say goodbye. Kathy, Jess, and I continued to play without Zoe, which proved to also be a mistake. The place where Zoe was sitting felt ice cold compared to the rest of the room, and the planchette kept changing places on the board without us touching it. We closed up the board, put it away, and tried to move on from the experience. Later that evening, while we were eating dinner, Jess's 5-year-old brother began telling us about his imaginary friend, Hector, who conveniently had the same description and backstory to his older sister's childhood imagination. We asked if he knew anything about his sister's imaginary friend. He said no. All of the paranormal talk reached Jess's mom, who quickly sent us home, and we were never invited back again. About 20 years ago, my great-grandmother passed when I was in my early teens. We didn't live in the same state as her, so unfortunately we missed her funeral, but were able to drive 2,000 miles to visit the rest of my family a couple of weeks later. I come from a Catholic family, so it was no surprise that in her home, she had the typical religious candles and statues of many saints. Among the things, there was a blonde doll in a blue dress in a glass cabinet. We were told by my aunt that the doll's hair grew, and apparently they regularly took care of it, bathed it, washed its clothes, trimmed its hair. They were also convinced that a spirit was living in it. Coincidentally, my mom was familiar with the doll and tried to convince me that the doll's hair had grown. I wasn't buying it. I paid close attention to the length of hair. The hair flowed a little past her shoulders, nothing spectacular. Looked like regular doll hair too. A couple of years later, my grandmother wanted to revisit our out-of-state family members. So what did I do when I first got there? Yep, I immediately went to the doll. Its hair had outgrown the length of the doll. I talked with my family and they said the doll was grief-stricken due to the passing of my great-grandmother, that they saw tears streaming down her face a couple of days after we had previously seen them. They explained that they had stopped cutting her hair because apparently that was my great-grandmother's thing. I haven't seen the rest of my family since, but we hear from them every once in a while, and the doll is still with them. Hair still growing and everything. Totally bizarre. Never did get an explanation about where the doll came from, except that it may have come from Mexico. My mom grew up in Venezuela. My grandpa escaped there during the Civil War, and with their savings bought a small farm and some property in the capital. This all happened when she was about 8 or 9, so around 1962 to 63 at my grandparents' farm. Back then, radio was all the rage, and they had just bought a fancy new radio for the farm. It must have been like 11 or 12 a.m., and my grandpa was sleeping, but my mom was up listening to radio shows. It was a kind of a hot night, so the balcony and most of the windows in the living room were open. She was starting to fall asleep, so she decided to call it a night and turn off the radio. She went to close the balcony window, and that's when she saw it. It was a small creature, just a little smaller than her, and it was hunched over behind a large sofa, just watching her. It had very large almond-shaped black eyes and grayish leather skin with arms longer than its body. She said it kind of looked like a gorilla in the way its arms touched the floor. She obviously screamed at the top of her lungs. The creature seemed to panic and ran to grab her arm and pulled her towards the balcony, but she resisted long enough for my grandma and grandpa to arrive. The little guy let go of her arm and escaped through the balcony before my grandpa could reach him. My grandpa went out looking for this gray for the better part of an hour, but he didn't find anything. They all slept in the same bed that night, and they never left the windows open at night ever again. Now, here's the kicker. I figured she just made up that story. Back when I was a kid, I was really into aliens and the supernatural, and I figured she had just made up a story to entertain me. But when I asked my grandma about it one night, she told me her side of the story, and she gave me an almost perfect description of that same little guy. My grandmother is also a very serious person, so I really doubt she would have told me something like that as a joke, even as a kid. Sadly, I could never get my grandpa's side of the story because he died soon after I was born. But it's a story I always remember from time to time because it really freaked me out as a kid. This all happened in the house that I grew up in. We moved in when I was about 2 and moved out when I was about 17. I've got several stories about this house, but I'll start with the little boy's spirit. My mom, stepdad, and I lived in this brick house in the middle of a cul-de-sac in a quiet little neighborhood. My parents worked second and third shifts and would often leave me home alone even at an early age, probably starting at around 6 or 7 years old, but it was never an issue. It was a safe neighborhood and I really just played video games and kept out of trouble. However, even being home alone, the house always seemed to have this "you're not alone" feeling to it. I didn't know any better because I had always lived there and thought that was just a normal thing. For my 6th birthday, my parents had bought a cat, and that was probably about the time that I began to take notice that things were not exactly normal in the house. Our cat would look around the room for no apparent reason and oftentimes just stare at empty spots in the room. The strangest thing was that she would sit for hours at the end of our long wood hallway and just look towards our rooms even though no one was down there. One night while my family and I were trying to sleep, I was woken up by childlike laughing coming from beside or underneath my bed. Being the incredibly brave little kid I was, I yelled, flew out of my bed, and ran to my parents' room across the hall and told them what had happened. Years later, they had informed me that they had been aware of the kid's spirit for many years and often interacted with him with no issue. He would turn on the VCR and hit play on whatever tape was in the player. They would hear him running up and down the hallway while I was away at my biological dad's house for the weekend, or see him in his little blue polo shirt peeking around the corner of the wall while my mom did dishes. The night of the laughing incident and my discomfort with it led them to research how to help the boy pass on. From what they tell me, they left a lit candle in the middle of the hall and an open Bible next to it during the night. I apologize. I don't know which passage as I'm not a religious person. We never heard from the boy again, so I hope he found peace, but that didn't stop the "you're not alone" feeling. The second entity was more of a watcher kind of spirit. He would never directly interact with us, but you could sometimes seem to catch a glimpse of him from the corner of your eye. He was about 6'3" from what we could tell, and it was always just a shadowy figure of a man. Aside from never feeling alone, he was of no harm but did make for an uneasy feeling at times. He was just always there. When I was 17, due to some financial issues, we had to move. We were leaving the house that I grew up in behind and leaving the watcher to himself. I only had a few more days left of high school, and my parents were working on moving everything to the new house. On the final night, I didn't feel like driving from our new house to school in the morning, so I opted to stay by myself that night. The house was entirely empty aside from my mattress that I left on the ground in my room and my alarm clock. At about 3:30 in the morning, I woke up and saw the shadowy pair of legs standing right beside me. It was strange this time, though. He stayed for much longer than usual, and I didn't feel uncomfortable. I felt calm. There wasn't a noise to be heard. Everything was just still and quiet. I began to shift my gaze up towards his face, and he melted with the darkness of the room. I took a moment and went back to sleep. I told my parents about this when I got home from school, and they confirmed having seen the man several times as well. When I was about 20, I decided to take a friend over to see the house that I grew up in. The realtor sign still sat there, and the house remained empty. I went through the backyard and went to open the back door. It was unlocked. I opened the door and looked into the darkness of the house. This wave of sadness and loneliness washed over me like nothing I'd experienced before. I imagine it was a mixture of seeing my childhood home so empty and also the watcher's feelings of being alone for so long. I left immediately, but occasionally drive through the area just to see it. An older couple is now living there. I wonder if they can feel the Watcher Man. I've never taken illegal drugs, never tried them, not once. I've always been hyper allergic to nicotine and also cannabis. Got drunk twice at the age of 14, threw up twice, and never touched alcohol again. All of my life I've had paranormal experiences, much more than the normal person. Seen ghosts many times, had many prophetic dreams and premonitions, and many strange events since I had a near-death experience at the age of 11. So I was driving on a truck interstate about 19 months ago. I was in California, in Lebec, which is north of Los Angeles, and I was at a large truck stop. This truck stop had a very small movie cinema for truckers. It was free. The film that was playing was with Brad Pitt. He was a tank commander during World War II. He spoke German. Very good film. During the last of the film is a scene where a tank runs over a man, crushing him. At this point, I had a flash that I would be run over as well. I leapt up and ran out of the little cinema, back to my truck. You see, all of my flashes come true. What do I mean by flashes? Did you see the film Noah with Russell Crowe? Noah has flashes of his world being flooded, just like that, but all the flashes were shorter, otherwise exactly like that. So about a week or so later, I'm in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Now, I had a large map book with all the freeways in the country. I used to stare at Lake Havasu City. Don't ask me why. I never planned to move there. I just used to stare at it often before going to sleep. One day, I get dispatched to drop a trailer off there and pick up another. So I go to Lake Havasu and I drop a trailer. I put on my truck's parking brake. I hear the pshhh, which means the brake had been engaged, air brake. So I get out and go to the back and I unlatch the trailer. My truck is still on neutral, and there is a slight decline. All of a sudden, my truck starts to take off very slowly. The air brake did not engage or become unengaged. Panicked, I tried to push the fifth wheel pin back in, which was silly that I now think of even trying it, but I panicked. My foot gets caught under a moving tire of the truck. I quickly turn to run, and I should have just fell backwards looking back on it. The tire quickly breaks my left leg. I think to myself to jump down flat so the tire doesn't rip my leg bone out of my leg. The truck slowly rolls over my left buttocks, my left leg, and my right foot and ankle. Two wheels do, crushing them as they go. I can feel something go snap, crackle, and pop in my left hip and my left ankle. I lean over all I can to the right so the truck does not roll over my chest and head. The truck rolls clear and slowly continues rolling down another 50 feet until it hits a fence. It was a horrible crash. I roll over and notice my femur bone trying to stick through my skin. The accident was not painful at all. No pain whatsoever. I was in shock. Long story short, the paramedics finally get there after about 40 minutes, and I get hauled off to the Lake Havasu Regional Medical Center, where I would stay for 8 weeks. I would go back home to Oregon using a walker like a little old lady. 19 months of physical therapy. Today, I can walk okay, but I can't run, and I can't go up or down stairs normally. My trucking company fired me, assuming I was lying about putting on my air brake. They claim I never did. Actually, I did, very sure of that. Anyway, while in the hospital, they put me on morphine, which made me feel sick. I finally convinced them to give me something else because the morphine made me feel like throwing up constantly. On morphine, I would have the same exact dream day after day, night after night. It was just a group of people under a tree. Looked like 1940s France or Italy, but in color. Just a group of people. One guy would look at a newspaper and then run, like he was excited. Then the people would gather and talk. I couldn't hear words. People looked French or maybe Spaniards or Italians. Same dream, 100 times a day and night. Day and night. During those dreams I got the knowledge that everything that has happened and will happen has already happened thousands of times, millions of times even. Also, I got the knowledge that everything that can happen has already happened million upon millions of times, almost an infinite number of times. While I was getting sick of the same dream repeating itself and the sickly feeling when I was awake, I begged them to give me something different, and they did, and the repeating dream stopped. Thank goodness. And the next night I opened my eyes and found myself in the hospital bed, and I looked over under the television, and there was a figure of a man, very shiny, and what looked like a Heil Hitler salute. He was saluting me. I closed my eyes and rubbed them, and opened my eyes again, and he was still there, saluting me. Have you ever seen an old analog TV when it was on no channel? It had just had snow on it? That's what he looked like, all over, but brighter than that. I closed my eyes again and opened them, and he was still there, not moving, just saluting. He stayed there for about 15 minutes, and I waved at him before I finally went back to sleep. I had a friend who once took magic mushrooms. I never tried them. He said he took magic mushrooms and looked at a tree, and he could see the tree breathing, and the tree was communicating with him somehow, not by voice. Most of you will say this was all hallucination. To the ancient peoples, a hallucination was a vision of another reality. Visions were not our imagination, but the window to another dimension. I had a friend who told me that one day she was very sick, high fever. She saw the wife of her husband's best friend holding a large knife coming towards her saying, "I'm going to kill you." And this was during the day. Many years later, she discovered that this woman actually hated her with a passion, but she was nice to her at the time. She hid her hatred. She wanted her husband for herself. Some scientists think that in the quantum world, all possible realities exist, and everything that can possibly happen has already happened many, many, many times. I started dating this girl recently, and she's revealed to me that she's seen and spoken to ghosts. Then she said that she's seen them daily. She was at my house the week before and asked if there were any ghosts there, because I felt a strange presence in my house several times over the years. She said there were 3, one in the front living room. She thinks he died there a long time ago and they want to be left alone. There was another one in my garage that she wasn't sure was a ghost, but an entity, like leftover emotions of anger and rage gathered in an area, kind of like the goo under the city in Ghostbusters. The third one she said was always with me. She said that he's been with me on every one of our 6 or so dates so far. Now that she's comfortable telling me about it, I ask lots of questions and generally don't believe in psychics or any of that, so I tried to not let her trick me into thinking she was right when she said general answers and I gave her specifics. I was very skeptical and careful. We went through several questions for a few hours and she began calling out specifics. For example, she called that he wore leather wristbands, biker boots, and a sleeveless vest. She knew he had a green guitar and we rode motorcycles together. She knew he had long hair and a mustache. She even called 2 specific tattoos on his neck and upper arm. My girlfriend knows nothing of this person at all, never spoke of him, and I knew him when I lived in a different state. None of this is logically possible, and I'm pretty convinced at this point. But it's a hard pill to swallow. I don't think she's crazy. She's very intelligent and well-spoken, holds a high position at work and a healthy home life. There's no way she could have known any of this, and she asked me, He shot himself, didn't he?" I replied yes. She also gave me details as to how the ghosts communicate with her, and details about how the deaths, like the black robe and scythe, but apparently there are several of them, not just one, enter our realm and take away the freshly deceased. I'm completely shaken and unsure of how to process all of this. Personally, I'm an atheist, but I do see this as completely plausible. It's just a lot to take in. I've only known her a little over a month. My relative had passed about 16 months ago. Shortly after his death, his Facebook and other profiles were taken down. I've asked his girlfriend and one of his best friends if they could give me some pictures of him, but they couldn't find many or even recent ones since they all got deleted with his Facebook. There were several new tattoos he got right before he passed, and those are the ones she called specifically in the general shape and style and exact position on the body. There's nowhere I can see online with pictures of him with his brand new tattoos before he passed. This was when I lived in New York. I now live in Texas. My girlfriend could not have ever seen him before. She knew I rode motorcycles, but she didn't know he did, and he happened to be my only riding buddy that dressed like a biker. She hasn't figured out his name yet. She said she'd like to be closer to me and closer to him to find out his name. If she does, I think I'll be convinced. January 2012. I bought a horse and began boarding it at a very old barn. It was a small, tight-knit, friendly barn community not far from my home. It had been around since the 60s, surrounded by woods. There were 3 barns. The main arena was entirely surrounded by thick woods, and there were small trails in the woods behind the property. Fast forward to June 2012. I had 2 horses there now. I was there every single day without fail, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. I fed the horses and cared for them. I rode one every night as well, mainly in the arena, but sometimes in the barnyard. There were no field or arena lights, just the moon and stars. One evening around 5 p.m., I was sitting on her, letting her stand when she was starting to snort and back up. I looked up and saw this white, gray creature crawling out of the woods towards us. It had a very small round head. Its eyes were just pits. It had a very small mouth, not much detail there. Its arms were very long and thin, fingers also like that. Its rib cage was very pronounced and defined, and its legs were long and lanky. Its movements were very jerky, not smooth and fluid. It slowly jerked out to us when my horse turned and bolted out of the arena. She's a dead broke, calm, well-mannered horse who never spooked before this. She would not go back into the arena that night. I walked her around the barnyard, staying near the main barn, put her up and ran out to peek into the arena, to find nothing except some footprints where I saw the thing. Throughout the summer, I saw it peeking, almost dancing around the gate that led into the woods where the trails were. One night, roughly a month later, at about 9 p.m., I was riding that horse again in a front pasture. The moon was full and bright, and I looked to my left to see that creature running full speed by my side on the other side of the fence. I slowed my horse to a stop, and it took off around the corner and behind the side barn into the woods. I continued seeing it, mainly in the woods, but it was always around. Summer 2013, the barn shut down when the owner died. We moved the horses to a friend's place for the time being, and I didn't see it there. Late summer and fall 2013, I found a new barn. Woods directly behind the barn and arena. This place had lights and was much newer. About a month later, when I was getting ready to leave, I heard something in the woods. I looked down the barn aisle into the woods and saw the creature running down the road into the woods. I saw it much less frequently for a while, until later in fall 2014 I began seeing it in the back pastures woods. It darted in and out of the tree line. I saw a second one sitting in a neighbor's yard. It would sit in the same spot every day and watch me ride. I kept seeing it occasionally, but from a much greater distance than at the first barn. I went with this barn owner to another farm to get some stuff when I saw a very, very large version of this creature run out from the woods, right behind a tree I was 10 feet from while I was alone by the trailer. Last November, I house sat for the barn owners. I went out around 2 a.m. to fill water troughs and enjoy the full moon and cold night. I was sitting in the back pasture when 3 of the creatures began coming from the woods. One came up to the trees near the trough where I was. The other 2 were walking along the tree line. The horses were silently munching their hay pretty far from where the creatures were. I messaged the guy from earlier and told him what was going on. Since that incident, I haven't really seen them. Last summer, I did see one outside my house staring into the windows. A few weeks ago, one was outside my bedroom windows tapping and making a strange, faint, shrieking sound. I know this sounds totally crazy, and I probably wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen to me. I've never been a believer in the paranormal, but honestly I just have no idea what to make of what happened last night. I will say again before you read this, it sounds insane, but please know I'm telling the truth. I wasn't drunk or high, and I was with a friend who saw the exact same thing. I go to college at a smallish school in Wisconsin. One thing this school is known for is having crazy parties out in the surrounding woods. I know it's stupid, but it's one way to make sure that campus PD don't come in and shut it down. I haven't ever gone to these parties. I've had difficulty with anxiety, but after 2 years of therapy and medication, I finally decided I wanted to go to at least one party before I graduate. I'm a senior. So anyway, I talked to my friend Gina, who's known as a bit of a party girl, and she tells me there's going to be a big party in the woods this Thursday. A lot of kids at my school don't have class on Friday, and we make plans to go. So last night, me and her head out down a trail into the woods with flashlights, and we joke about how creepy it was. Everything is going smoothly at first until we go down a smaller trail that was only about 2 feet wide instead of the normal roadside trails that usually go through the woods. I was kind of freaked out, but didn't say anything because I assumed she knew where she was going. So we follow this trail a bit longer and eventually come to a sort of clearing where the trees aren't too dense, and we see a towel and a few bottles on the ground. At this point, my friend tells me that she got a bit turned around, but knows that we're close to the party because she's been at this clearing before, and she starts calling out, "Hey!" hoping somebody will hear her and shout back. When this doesn't work, she takes out her phone and calls one of her friends that she said she was going to meet at the party. The friend answers, and the friend apparently tells her where they are. Gina then tells me that she knows where they are and that we're close. I joke that she better not get me killed, and as we nervously laugh, we hear a nya 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 sound coming from behind us, followed by what sounded like a cross between a whistle of an old train and somebody blowing. It sounds stupid, but it's almost like the whistle of Thomas the Train, and we turn around thinking, what the fuck was that? And shine our lights on a deer standing up on its hind legs with one arm against the tree, looking at us. I know this sounds stupid, but just the way that it was watching us and standing there was the most unsettling thing I've seen in my life. My friend then takes off running, and I'm still just standing there looking at it, trying to make heads or tails of it before I start running too after Gina, trying not to be left alone with this thing. Luckily for me, Gina runs into a tree, and I catch up with her and start yelling at her about leaving me alone when we hear another whistling sound out to the left of us and turn our flashlights to see another deer looking at us, but this one is walking towards us on its hind legs, but not like a person, like a dog. It gets close but walks behind a tree with only its head and neck poking out, watching us. I've never been so scared in my life and started to cry and started to yell at Gina, telling her to call the cops, like that would have done any good. At this point, I honestly thought I was going to die. I was just so scared, and we heard another whistle sound come somewhere else in the woods behind us. We heard a rustling sound in the woods and were sure that this was it, and we were going to die. But instead, out walked a giant, and I mean giant, like Newfoundland size but with short hair like a lab, black dog. The dog then walked right up to us, looked at us, looked out at the deer right behind the tree, which started to make a nya-nya sound like we heard earlier, but the dog just stood there looking at it, not growling or barking or anything, just staring. The deer then started to make a coughing sound, but the dog just snarled at it without making a noise before turning around and just ignoring it and walking over to us and started barking and baying. A minute later, a professor who I'd taken a class with sophomore year burst through the bush and started yelling at Baron, his dog who had apparently run away into the woods. He was really confused to see us, but saw that we were crying and offered to take us back home and drive us back to campus. I haven't slept since last night and have been all over the internet trying to make sense of what I saw. I grew up in a small suburb about 30 minutes outside of Portland, Oregon. We were a family of 5, 2 parents and 3 daughters. There was an age gap between me and my sisters by 5 and 7 years. Being the baby of the family, I would complain to my mom and she would force them to play Barbies with me. They didn't often play with me of their own volition, so I spent a lot of time playing by myself. My mom started noticing that when she'd enter my room, or any room I was alone in, she would catch me talking to thin air. She would ask me who I was talking to, and I would tell her very matter-of-factly, Charlie. My mom was puzzled and asked who Charlie was. I never met anyone named Charlie to that point, she had said, and I would just say he was my best friend. My mom was a very leery individual. We are superstitious Irish Native American family after all. But she chalked it up to being my first imaginary friend, and I was a very imaginative kid. After a while, she noticed that I was talking to Charlie a lot and grew curious, so she asked me what he looked like. She said that at first I was dumbfounded by the fact that she couldn't see him. To me, he was a solid human sitting in the room, Bruce Willis in the Sixth Sense style. I gave her a very odd description. Not your typical imaginary friend who was half unicorn and half monkey. He was a very tall old man with very big hands, and he was always smiling. Charlie always wore sweaters and wore a very elaborate belt buckle like a cowboy. Later, she told my dad about my description of Charlie, and his jaw dropped. One thing you need to understand about my dad is that he is a hardcore skeptic. But as soon as my mom relayed the description he had said, that is the exact description of my grandpa, Charlie. We didn't have any photos of Charlie in my house, so they were pretty perplexed. The backstory of my dad's relationships makes me kind of sad nowadays. Of course, he didn't tell me back then. I was 3 to 4 years old, but they were very close. He was close with my aunt and uncle too and loved his grandkids very much. When my dad was about 4 years old, my grandparents moved out of state from Missouri to Louisiana, which took them pretty far away from Grandpa Charlie, who was crushed by this news. My dad loved visiting though. They had a huge farm with lots of animals and tractors. It was a kid's wonderland, before technology turned kids into gamer hermits who were allergic to the sun. He died when my dad was 8 or 9 of kidney failure, his wife shortly after. My parents have never discussed Grandpa Charlie in front of me, and they were sure of it. Both of them were taken aback. Though Charlie caused all sorts of mischief, 2 occasions really cemented the fact that he wasn't just imaginary. There was a laundry room in our duplex that was more like a little corridor or mudroom. For the sake of perspective, when facing towards the washer and dryer, there was a door to the right which led to the backyard, and a door to the left that led into the house. Every time she went to do laundry, she would keep the door to the laundry room open so she could hear me if I needed her. And every single time she was in there, the door would shut, multiple times a day. My mom didn't even connect that it would be something paranormal until she tried to prop the door open. It didn't matter what she put in front of the door. Whatever it was got pushed out of the way just enough to get the door closed again. The door was one of those hollow wooden doors, not heavy at all, but the house was solid. The floors and door frames were not warped. One day my mom is doing the laundry and the door closes on her again. At this point she wasn't afraid. She was getting pretty annoyed with it. Even though she felt ridiculous, she felt compelled to say in a very stern voice, "Charlie, if that's you, will you please stop shutting the door on me? I'm trying to get things done." And after that, the door to the laundry room never shut on its own again. I think Charlie was trying to show in subtle ways he was around. But one day, he decided to go with a not-so-subtle approach. My mom, my sisters, and I were watching TV one night in the living room. Suddenly, the radio in my sister's bedroom turned on full blast, as did my parents' radio alarm clock. Everyone freaked out except me. Thinking some strangers were in the house, my mom ushered us to the front door, opened it, and told us to stand in the front yard. "If you hear me scream, run to the neighbor's house and call 911. My mom grabbed the nearest heavy object and went to investigate. It took her a minute to realize my sisters and I were right behind her, following her into the dark house. My parents were sticklers about turning off lights to save electricity. She turned on every light on the way towards the rooms with the radios. Both rooms were across from each other at the end of the hall, and from the hall we could clearly see that there were no intruders in either room. After turning off the radios and checking the closets, my mom just couldn't figure out what happened. She heard me giggling and asked what was so funny, and I replied, "It's okay. It's just Charlie, Mom." Apparently, it was a very funny joke to me at 3. If it happened now, I would definitely need to change my pants. The weirdest part was to turn my sister's radio, you had to turn 2 knobs. One to turn the radio from off to FM radio, then twist a different knob to turn up the volume. This is an old school radio. Even in the early 90s, it was considered antiquated. This event freaked my sisters out, but my mom brushed it off and convinced them it was no biggie. An electrical anomaly, she said. My sisters didn't buy a word of it, so we all slept in my mom's room that night. We lived there for a year, and I was very sad to be leaving. I vaguely remember the sadness, but my mom said it was tough for me. I told her the house was crying too, which is what was making me cry. Charlie didn't follow us to the new house, or maybe he did, but he never showed himself to me after that. I like to think that he is still around, watching over me. I've always been told that I must have a guardian angel because I used to do a lot of stupid things, and it's kind of a miracle I've never been arrested and or hurt or killed. Now, not all supernatural stories are scary, and my parents were comforted knowing someone else was looking out for me too.